Good evening, and welcome to Understanding and Dismantling Racism. This is session 2 of a 4-session program, and tonight's topic is, what is institutional racism? So let's get started. Now, last week, I explored the concept of racism as a social construct and offered a definition of racism that included both race prejudice and institutional power. And this is that definition. And it is racism equals race prejudice plus the sanctioned misuse of institutional and systemic power. Now, there are 3 types of racism that are important for us to understand. The first is personal racism. And personal racism is the expression of systemic racism through the attitudes, the beliefs, and the behaviors of individuals. It involves a complex process of socialization that is internalized in people of all races. And I'll talk more about this socialization process in our 3rd session. Cultural racism is the imposition of one racial group's culture as being dominant or normative, while seeking to devalue the cultural identities of other people, either through outright destruction or expropriation. It's adopting a way of doing and a way of being that favors one group's ways of doing and being, while discrediting other ways of doing and other ways of being. Now, in religious institutions, this may include the forms of prayer and worship and song. It could include the design of the worship space. Or it also includes judgments about what people think are acceptable expressions of faith that are based really more on cultural preferences than on dogma or doctrine. The 3rd type of racism is the topic for tonight's presentation, and that is institutional racism. Institutional racism takes place when the control and access to resources within society's institutions are disproportionately and systematically determined by the dominant racial group for their benefit and to the detriment of other racial groups. This would include institutional policies and procedures. This would include decisions on how resources are allocated within institutions and systems. It would also include the way institutions set goals and mission statements, and of course, the way they choose their leaders and hire their personnel. Now, I'm going to share with you a 29-minute video clip from that video series, Race, the Power of Illusion. And this clip does a good job of explaining an example of institutional and systemic racism. It focuses on the issue of housing and how housing policies in the United States contributed to the racial wealth gap that we see today, and also helped really to construct our ideas of what identity is all about. Now, as you watch this video, I'm going to give you an assignment. See if you can take a list and make a list of all the different institutions and systems that are identified in this video. Okay? See how many you can identify.
But perhaps the best example of how European ethnics would finally gain the full benefits of whiteness came with an innovation in housing at the end of World War II. It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
Living space was at a premium. In the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were 2 families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by insuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember, the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home, we're interested in buying one, and what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? so forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was supposed, that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian, it now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way. A utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which are called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were Black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more Black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates, therefore they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families.
At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today, we have many of the same practices without the explicit language. And those practices are largely inscribed in geography. And so geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are our housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space in the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market one white, one black, a housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. That house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, you know, a relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? You know, well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be a colorblind society that values the content of character over the color of skin. The hope of thousands of newcomers who arrive each year is that we already are.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic of which
I don't see color. I see people, the saying goes.
There are people from 100 other nations who look different from you. People whose religion, history, skin color, and reason for being here today may be different from yours.
But in post-civil rights America, is color blindness the same as equality?
The notion of color blindness came to us from that famous I Have a Dream
speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he said that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of the skin. And what has happened in the post-civil rights era is that whites have assumed that we're already there, that we're in a society where color does not matter.
On the one hand, the civil rights era officially ended inequality of opportunity, officially ended de jure legal inequality. At the same time, those civil rights triumphs did nothing to address the underlying economic and social inequalities that had already been in place. It doesn't recognize the fact that the rewards, the house, the Lexus, the big bank account, those are not only the rewards of the pot of gold at the end of the game, they're also the starting position for the next generation.
The wealth gap grows. The advantages of being white accumulate from one generation to the next.
What are the benefits or the advantages to being white in a society that has historically given benefits and advantages to members of the dominant group? And if you are a person who has that privilege, you don't necessarily notice it.
So until we recognize that there's really no way to talk about equality of opportunity without talking about equality of condition, then we're stuck with this paradoxical idea of a colorblind society in a society that's totally unequal by color.
Claiming we don't see race won't end racial inequality. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way.
And just as we're born into this system, we don't ask to be loaded up with stereotypes or omissions or distortions when we come into the world. We don't ask to be in a structure which is unfair, but that's what we have inherited. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter.
I think we have to be uncomfortable with the present racial arrangement. In a sense, I think we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to demand more of ourselves and more of our country, and willing to make the invisible visible.
I think we all have to think about, what can I influence? I don't influence everything, but the things I do influence, I can think about, how am I making this a more equitable environment? I can ask myself, who's included in this picture and who isn't? Who's had opportunities in my environment and who hasn't? What can I do about that?
So, the key word, I think, from our definition of racism as it relates to institutional racism is this word, power. Ultimately, racism is about the exercise of power, and institutions and systems are one of the primary ways that power is distributed and exercised in our society. Another important thing to understand about institutional racism is that systems of racial control and oppression do not require our racial hatred or prejudices in order to thrive. All they need is our indifference. And often this racial indifference gets masked by using the language of colorblindness, which often gets expressed in the refusal to consider race as a factor when setting policies and procedures. As a result of this kind of colorblindness, we see a freezing into place of the status quo that ensures that the current systems that allocate power and resources remain the same. Institutions can hold diversity training workshops for their employees to try and keep individual racist attitudes and behaviors in check. And some people of color may get hired as long as they're the right kind of people of color, as long as they're not the kind that will make waves or try to challenge the status quo. But strategies of institutional colorblindness often allow the fundamental structures of power to remain the same. This is why more and more people are coming to the realization that it's really not enough to be non-racist. In order to achieve the kind of transformation that is necessary to end racism in our society, we need to be anti-racist. And I love this quote about anti-racism. It says, "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's really the only way forward." So we need to do more than just refrain from racist behaviors and attitudes. We need to actively dismantle racist structures that enable systems of racial control and oppression to persist. Now, next week, we're going to be exploring the concept of internalized racist oppression, which is experienced by people of color, and internalized racist superiority, which is expressed in white power and privilege. It's part of that larger task that was referred to in the video of making visible what is invisible. But now, I'd like to stop here and use the remaining time we have left to address any questions or comments you might have about what we've covered so far. The first question we have is this: how do we reconcile the pride that we have in our Naperville community and town while acknowledging that there were probably restrictions on who could and could not live here? That's an excellent question. And it's a question that many communities now are struggling with and are beginning to address. The citizens here in Naperville have a lot to be thankful for. But we need to recognize that the history, the official history that we've been taught about this town is incomplete. And so part of the work that we need to do is to recover the history of missing voices about the founding and about the development of our city. And this concludes looking at the ways that some people were allowed and others not allowed to live here with us. I think some kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would be very appropriate. It'd be a way of acknowledging past wrongs and making a determined effort to make amends for those wrongs. And this could be part of a new chapter in Naperville's history that would make future generations of Napervillians very proud to be a part of this community. Okay, here's another question. Have you followed any of the actions in Evanston regarding housing reparations? Well, this is a good example of a community taking this challenge seriously. I think that the Evanston's reparation efforts centering on addressing these historic housing inequalities that we've talked about and studied tonight, like the ones we studied tonight, is very important. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, I don't know all the details about this plan or its effectiveness, but I think it's an important thing to pay attention to learn from, and maybe to model in the future. Okay, here's another question. How do we raise awareness about racism to white family and friends who get defensive about being called racist or deny that it even exists. Wow, this is a huge issue. Because I'll tell you, going out and marching in the streets or writing letters to your congressman or any of these other kinds of activity is easy compared to dealing with your own family with these very, very difficult questions and issues. First, I think it does very little good to call your family members racist. It just doesn't work very well. They get very, very defensive, understandably so. It's better if they come to that conclusion themselves. All right, so how do we move them to a better understanding of what is invisible to them and make that visible? I think you can start by sharing your own story and stating quite honestly, and this is true for myself too, that I am a recovering racist. I am a recovering racist. I may be racist, but that's not all I am. I'm also on a journey of recovering and ending and dismantling and eliminating racism from my heart, from my mind, and from my actions. So own that and let your family members know that you're on that journey. Share your story of recovery. Share your stories of both your successes, but also what you struggle with and what you continue to struggle with. And then call out racist behavior and attitudes when they happen. So you're not condemning the person, you're condemning the actions, the behavior, or the attitude that's expressed. And you can do this in a way that is not judgmental about the essence or the identity of that person. You do so by pointing out why that behavior you disagree with, or why that attitude you strongly disagree with. So you can say, I disagree with you, without condemning that person or ending your relationship with that person. Okay, here's another question. It says here, I'm a beneficiary of the GI Bill, housing appreciation, et cetera, et cetera. What can I do to make up for the fact that Black GIs did not get the same benefits as I did? I want to begin with this one by stating that my family got to where it is precisely because of the GI Bill and all of the FHA loans and things that were available shortly after World War II. My father was a World War II veteran. He was the first in his family to ever go to college. And because of all of those housing programs, we got to own our own home. And that set the course for the rest of our futures. It set the course for my life. It set the course for my brothers and sisters' lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives. Everything that we have can be traced back to those legislations and the wealth that we were able to accrue because of that. So what do we do going forward? Well, first, we support fair housing efforts everywhere that we live. And we recognize that overtly racist housing policies of the past may be gone, but zoning and planning regulations are doing the same work that racist housing policies did so long ago. In Naperville, most folks who contribute to the quality of life that we enjoy here cannot afford to live here. That includes me. You know, I call myself a member of the Naperville community, but I can't afford to live here. I live in Aurora. Many people responsible for the quality of life in this city cannot afford to live here. So we need to recognize that, and we need to fight fight, 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 this whole NIMBYism, not in my backyard. People, your neighborhoods, you need to be open to people who don't look like you, who are from a different class, who need affordable housing. The people who are cleaning your office buildings, the people who cut your lawns and take care of your groceries, who serve your food at your favorite restaurants, those people need housing. And they need housing where we are living, in our neighborhoods. We got to accept people living around us who don't look like us, who don't pray like us, who don't earn the same money that we do. That's going to be crucial. Right now in Naperville, there's a struggle going on. Our friends at the Islamic Center of Naperville are trying to build a mosque, but there's huge number of people resisting that. Of course, they won't say it's about them being Muslims. They talk about traffic, they talk about this, they talk about that. But in the end, it's hard to separate all that out. If there was a Methodist church being built on that land, or a Catholic church, I doubt if the resistance and opposition would be nearly as strong. So it's something we need to look at, something we need to really face up to and address. Here's our last question. How can we celebrate, promote, and participate in other cultures without being guilty of cultural appropriation? Well, I think, first of all, it's commendable that people want to celebrate other people's cultures and participate in the richness and diversity of cultures that we have in this town and in this country. I think it's commendable. But it's important to give credit where credit is due. We need to make sure that we do that whenever we use or participate or expropriate from other cultures elements that we want to use for our own purpose. And we need to celebrate all of these cultural wealths and diversity in a way that is accountable to the communities that created them. This might mean inviting people from that community to speak at your event, or to give a presentation about where this particular dance or where this particular music came from, or why it was written in the way it was. And most important, that if you're going to use another culture's music and dance and whatever, that you also serve as an ally to that community. So you're not just taking, you're giving, that it's a mutual relationship of give and take. Okay, I think that's the end of our questions for tonight. I want to thank you for being with us. Hope you'll join us next week, same day, same time, and you can use the same link. So take care, God bless, and we'll see you next week.